Hello. So I want today to talk about self-care, although you may be wondering why this is my first screen. Um, we will get there. When we talk about what self-care actually means, and specifically the differences between the ways that we are socialized to view self-care and the ways that human beings actually take care of themselves in sustainable ways. When we talk about those differences, I feel like it's really, really, really important to talk about colonization in addition to that, because the truth of the matter is this. This image that you see in front of you is something that I've seen floating around on a few social media accounts, and the reality is this. There are reasons why we in the United States are not good at taking care of ourselves. There are reasons why much of the world is not good at taking care of themselves, but especially here in the United States. Um, when we talk about the influences of colonization, they have absolutely affected our ability to even know what we as human beings truly need in order to be happy, healthy, all the things that we truly want in life. So I want to start the conversation here. So we're going to start on a little bit of a heavier tone, but I promise we'll get to the good stuff. We'll get to what are things that we actually can do to reclaim some of this for ourselves. But again, I feel like it's important to start here. One of the things that I really love about this graphic is that it illustrates the way that these processes are cyclical. So colonization, we'll talk a bit more about that, has influenced and led to the widespread practices, you might call them, the widespread practices of supremacism and capitalism. And as you can see, this graphic illustrates, it becomes this cyclical nature wherein we're taught particular values based on the foundations of supremacy and capitalism. So we are taught certain values. We're taught to hold certain beliefs about human beings, about ourselves, as a result of these systems, and this is what then heavily goes on to influence our daily lives in ways that we don't even tend to realize. So we can see it points to inflammation and trauma as two of the major sorts of consequences of these processes. So really what this is illustrating is how this notion of supremacism, the notion that one group of people is better, more superior than another group of people, has led into supremacy being employed on the basis of race, supremacy being employed on the basis of gender, many other areas too, and supremacy being employed on the basis of viewing human beings as the only important entity on this earth. So when it points to ecocide, that's speaking to this deep separation that we've established between ourselves and the natural world, where we view the world, we're socialized to view the world as something that we take from, but we don't ever necessarily give back. We just take. And all of these processes working together lead to a lot of the social problems that we see today. So this is one image. I actually want to walk through a version that is similar, complementary, using, ta-da, the framework of a tree. If we think about how colonization has formed into the roots of this society, because that is how the United States as we know it today, that is how this country was formed, was on the backs of colonization. I want to point to a few key underlying elements of colonization that I really see strongly influencing our abilities to practice self-care today. So we'll walk through this just a little bit. Again, this is kind of a complementary image to the previous image, just expressed in a different way. And I'm going to focus a little bit more narrowly on to that self-care piece, the ways that we are emotionally and spiritually affected by colonization. So when we think about some of the roots of colonization, manifest destiny is certainly a term that comes into play. This was per a fantastic book that I strongly recommend to everyone, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. This was something I learned from reading parts of that book, where she talks about really being able to trace some of the initial conceptualization, some of the initial idea for colonization really being able to trace that back to this time period, and I believe, 1095, where the current Catholic Pope at the time in Europe essentially made connections between a certain population of people being destined and approved by God, and this was desired by God for them to go and take something away, take land away from another population. So manifest destiny can be traced back to this origin, but over time it's been known to just represent this notion that some of us deserve things and some of us don't. So if I have been raised in a land where I've been taught that my people are people of God, other people are not people of God, it is in my birthright to have access to this land, to these resources, to whatever else that these other people over here have, then I can use anything I need to accomplish that. If it's something that is deserving to me, then I can take it without having to feel sorry or feel bad or really humanize the other population that I'm taking those resources from. So if we flash forward a few hundred years and think of how settler colonization in the United States was socialized to be viewed as normal, socialized to be viewed as something that was good. In fact, settler colonizers arrived here. They truly believed, under what they had been taught about their own sense of manifest destiny, they truly believed that they had the right to take the land, take property, even take lives of other populations, of indigenous populations here. So manifest destiny really sort of situated religion as a justification in this sort of violence, genocidal type behavior. Going along with that, Calvinism came about in around the 1500s. Calvinism sort of talked about this along the same lens with Calvinism. This is stemming from John Calvinist, who was a philosopher, I suppose, and he focused on some changes that he believed needed to be made to Lutheranism at the time. And one of the notions that he put forth that wasn't even actually necessarily his biggest area of focus, but has since sort of been what's caught on in society today, is this notion of Calvinism, is this notion of predestination. The Protestant Calvinist work ethic you might be familiar with, where, there's lots of sayings that go along the same lines, but essentially, only when we're working hard are we close to God. Only when we are sacrificing are we close to God. To sit around, to not have things that fill our time, occupy our hands, keep our hands busy, that's sinful, that's of the devil, etc. So there was sort of like an added element, but underlying this, Calvinism had clear elements of predestination as well. And in fact, Calvinism, I believe, went on to influence some of how social Darwinism has been understood, or we could say misunderstood, in this society too. So Cartesianism is another sort of underlying foundational element, came from another dude with the last name of Cartesian. And this is a theory essentially about the separation of the mind and body. So a little less focused on, there's some people who deserve things, some people who are destined to have things, some people who aren't. I should point back with Calvinism actually too. A lot of this is trickled into capitalism today. So when we think of capitalism, within the realm of capitalism, people who work hard get what they deserve, right? Like that's sort of what we're socialized to believe about capitalism. That's what we're socialized to believe about the American dream. If we work hard enough, then we can get what we deserve. And again, we see pointing back to the Calvinist work ethic too. If I sacrifice for my family, then I will succeed. And on the flip side, what that means is if I look around in a capitalistic society and I see people who have not succeeded, it must be their fault. They're not trying hard enough. They're lazy. They're sinful. They weren't predestined to have a good life. For some reason, they were just destined to live in poverty. But it allows me to sort of like wash my hands and again, like not really have to feel badly about the life experiences of other people. Okay, so coming back to Cartesianism, a Cartesian worldview is views the mind and the body as separate. So this is kind of like it's not unconnected, but it's sort of a separate foundation. And I'll come back to why I'm bringing it up here. This is something that I've just started to read about, so I'm a little bit less familiar with this one. But it is the notion that, yes, the mind and body are separate, and it is a prioritization. Part of this theory, I would call it, was essentially that like the intellect is our brain, like the best way to make decisions, the best way to develop scientific advances, the best way to construct a society is not to feel within the body, is not to think holistically or feel holistically what is right in the situation. It is to get wrapped up in our brains, to think, rationalize everything, make everything logical, and then come to a conclusion. So Cartesianism really emphasized the mental cognitive capacities. If we think about education systems today, we can see where almost all of our emphasis lies, very much stemming from a Cartesian worldview where we were taught, where we were socialized again, we were socialized to believe that our brain was what was most important and our body was sort of secondary. Last thing I want to touch on, this is a more recent and a little bit more concrete of a thing, but we saw some of the manifest destiny, the Calvinistic, this notion of some people are deserving, some people are not, some people are just destined to have a crappy life, I suppose. We saw some of this come into fruition with the Elizabethan Poor Laws. So these date back to Europe, although they were instituted in the United States as well upon colonization. And if you look at our social services, this is still instituted. We just don't call it this. So the Elizabethan Poor Laws were laws that were established in the 1600s in Europe, essentially differentiating between the types of people who were deserving of assistance, so the types of people who were able to receive assistance at that particular time if they were struggling, and the types of people who weren't deserving of assistance. So essentially it came down to if you were a mostly able-bodied adult non-widowed person, then you were going to be deemed undeserving. You were not going to receive assistance because the theory was like, well, you should be working then. Again, if there's something happening and you're not working and you're poor, then you must be deserving of that. You must be lazy. You're not trying hard enough. Only the deserving poor were the folks who were able to receive aid. So the elderly folks, orphans, widows actually were considered, at least in the 1600s, to be deserving. People with physical disabilities. So again, when we look around at our social service agencies today, how do we as a society determine who is worthy and unworthy of receiving assistance? If a person comes into a social service organization and they need help, they're not able to just receive help, right? Like we don't trust people's words, we don't trust people's lived experiences. They have to prove, they have to submit paperwork, they have to show their income is low enough in order to qualify for disability assistance. Of course, they have to demonstrate they have some sort of quantifiable disability per the medical model, per Western society views. So we see the Elizabethan Poor Laws still coming into play in a lot of our systems today. All of these really. Okay, but let's take it a step up and talk about, so these are some of the like underlying, I would say like values of colonization. This is how colonization was developed. If we think of these aspects as like the soil in the earth that nurtured the seed of capitalism, these are the elements that were made up of that soil. So this is the time period when colonization, as we saw it in the United States, developed. Settler colonization of the United States, at least, began in the 1600s, so right on the cusp of quite a bit of this. I want to make a couple quotes. I want to point out a couple quotes. If you are wondering what settler colonization is, settler colonization is a little bit different from colonization generally. Settler colonization includes settlers, as you might imagine with the word. So settler colonization includes the arrival of settlers, the arrival of people to actually replace a certain population. So settler colonization is really the systematic replacement of indigenous populations with a more Eurocentric culture, with a, quote, civilized culture, with what was viewed to be civilized, which of course stemmed out of the roots that we are talking about here. There's an article I like that I believe I included the link for on this slide. There's an article that talks a bit more about settler colonization, and she identifies settler colonization as an ongoing system of power that perpetuates the genocide and repression of indigenous peoples and cultures. So one important thing that perhaps you're seeing on this slide is we often talk about colonization and we learn about colonization as though it's something that happened in the past. It is not something that happened in the past. We are living in colonization right now. That's the time period that we're at in history right now, is we are the daughters, sons, children, etc. of colonization. So settler colonization is something that started in the 1600s in this country, and it is something that is continuing today. It continues through our laws. It continues through certain policies that we have. It continues through our use of capitalism as an economic system. It continues through the ways that we educate people, through the use of policing, etc. So colonization is an ongoing process. And I wanted to pull this quote as well. The evolving field of settler colonialism studies arose from scholarship in Native American and Indigenous studies that engages with post-colonial studies and critiques the post in post-colonial as inappropriate for understanding ongoing systems of domination in places such as here, where colonialism is not a thing of the past because the settlers have come to stay, displacing the indigenous peoples and perpetuating systems that continue to erase native lives, cultures, and histories. So colonization continues. And of course, this, as we know, has had and continues to have a significant impact on indigenous cultures here, so populations that are indigenous to North America. It also has a lot of implications for us as the folks who were birthed into this colonialist system, if that is you, if you are not indigenous of this land. So this article talks about colonization quite primarily in the context of the indigenous experience. And of course, that is by far and large the most harmful aspect of colonization. What I really want to emphasize, though, and drive home is that colonization affects all of us, whether or not we are indigenous populations. All of us are colonized because all of us are being brought up in the system, and we're being taught these aspects of colonization. So we continue to be, quote, civilized through laws, through capitalism, through our education systems, through our law enforcement systems. All right, so how does this trickle into barriers for self-care? First of all, the isms. So the previous article also talks about how the isms are not just a consequence, they are a tactic of colonization. So per social constructionism, our identities only hold meaning because we have decided that they hold meaning. Science tells us the differences between people based on our physical appearance, based on our assigned sex at birth, our gender, our race. Science tells us that the differences between us because of those identities is like so minor, it's almost inconsequential. And yet we live in a society that places a great deal of emphasis on those things. So one of the ways that we see settler colonization playing out today that also creates a barrier to self-care for us is because it has created and continues to enforce social identity groups, such as gender and race. And man, I could go on a whole other video about that, but I'm gonna hold it back for the purposes of keeping the focus on self-care. But essentially it adds value. It's the part of what the isms has done is it's added a value, a judgment upon us based on physical characteristics or traits that really are not reflective of who we are in the inside. because again, those differences are so minor. And this is one of the ways that we see Calvinism, manifest destiny, those sorts of concepts continue to play out, is these aspects are used to divide us. These social identity groups have been created strategically for the purposes of oppression. Racism was a very intentionally created tactic used to justify things like slavery and race-based genocide. So we continue to see the influences of how the values that have historically been placed on those identity groups play out in our day-to-day lives and cause us to experience microaggressions all the way to macroaggressions, oppression, etc., on a daily basis. And if I am someone who in my day-to-day experience in the world experiences multiple forms of oppression, even if they're just microaggressions in one day, my ability to take care of myself is severely damaged because of the physical, the social, the emotional, the psychological damage that is done through oppression as a process, through me being denied at a job because of my gender or because of my race or because of some other identity characteristic, me not being able to get housing, even if it's just people calling me names in the street, giving me, suspicious looks or like moving away from me when I walk down the street. All of that has consequences on my health, my mental health and my physical health. Inspiration from nature is another huge barrier to self-care that stems from some of these foundations of colonization. So part of colonization included a specific attack on natural healing, and that was part of the underlying strategy of colonization before it was even employed in the United States. So colonization has always included an element of, I guess I would call it attack, an element of socializing us to view women's health, natural healing, to view indigenous practices, to view spiritual practices of ancient cultures as crazy, as mumbo jumbo, as like whatever term you might use, as devil worship. We were socialized to, again, because part of colonization, the emphasis is on creating a civilized, aka Eurocentric style population. So we were socialized, and we continue to be socialized to dismiss other practices. And we certainly see this playing out if you think about what you've learned or been taught about Eastern medicine, about the use of herbs, about meditation, yoga, chakras, etc. If you think about some of the messages that you hear about those practices, you'll see how this continues to play out today. So here we come back to Cartesianism. So one of the biggest harms I see in society today is our lack of understanding of mental health, and the treatment options that we do have for mental health. I'm going to say often the current treatments that we have for mental health actually cause more damage than they do help people. Institutionalization is still something that we use today. Electroshock therapy is something that we still use today. So maybe it is ECT. Some of the practices that we use today, even the expectation that talk therapy, that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, will work for certain populations is untrue. And it all comes back to this root of us not really being connected with our thoughts and our feelings and our body. So in this society, the primary goal is to like preserve the physical. Like we will keep people's bodies alive at any cost. And it doesn't matter if the person who is in that body doesn't want to continue living. It doesn't matter if they're severely depressed. It doesn't matter if they have some other, super intense mental health issue that is preventing them from actually having a happy life. a lot of our emphasis in this society is still on just keeping them alive, keeping their physical body going. And so what that means is that we have a lot of really unhappy people in the United States. I'm calling it a mental health crisis here, and a lot of folks have as well. We have really high rates of depression and anxiety. I think all of us sort of borderline have depression and anxiety in this society. There's so much stigma about mental health still, where people feel like they are weak, or people feel like they are crazy, or that there's something wrong with them if they're not able to function and do things the way that other people are doing them. Again, the emphasis on cognition in our education systems. We teach people how to think, but we don't teach them how to process their emotions. All of these things, huge barrier to our self-care practices today. Finally, there's just a huge suppression on individuality in this culture. And I would point colonization as the root of this as well. Part of colonization was very strictly enforcing assimilation, enforcing here's what your culture is now, and here's who you have to be. I mean, the use of boarding schools with indigenous populations was specifically designed to reprogram indigenous children to operate from a Eurocentric perspective. So there has historically been this great emphasis on sameness, on assimilation, on everybody needs to operate the same way. And this is part of, the attack on natural healing and on things that, from a Eurocentric perspective, people had difficulty understanding at the time. Rather than embracing difference, rather than being open and not making the assumption that my perspective, my understanding, my thoughts are better than your thoughts, rather than that, we live in a culture that continues to teach us how to be the same. And again, I would encourage you to think about your educational experience. I'd encourage you to think about elementary school and high school in particular, even college a bit. Part of what we're taught is how to fit in to society, right? Like part of what we're taught is how to fit into this society. And what does that mean? It means that we have to become a person who fits into this society. Okay. I could spend a long time on this slide, but I want to get to the good, uplifting stuff. So needless to say, there are a lot of things that prevent us from even understanding what self-care is in this society in a way that is sustainable and in a way that is like actually beneficial. So let's talk about some things of what's helpful and what's maybe a little less helpful in terms of common self-care practices. So I'm calling this slide self-care. Are we coping or are we healing? So by healing, what I mean is that another thing that the Cartesian worldview would like us to believe is that we need a medical expert. We need somebody outside of ourselves. We need a therapist, we need a doctor, we need somebody who's gone to, decades of schooling to come and tell us what's wrong with us and tell us how to get better, whatever our issue may be. What we're not taught is that humans naturally heal. And if we think about it, like I got a burn on my hand this weekend. You can see it. It's kind of yucky. So I got a burn on my hand this weekend. And of course I cleaned it and put ointment on it and wore a Band-Aid for a couple days. What I know is happening though, even when the Band-Aid's on it, even now that I'm having it breathe a little bit, I know it's healing. I know my skin is regrowing in that area. And eventually I might have a scar. I'll probably have a scar. But eventually I'm not going to have an open wound anymore, right? Like the wound is going to heal. My skin naturally heals. As long as I provide the conditions, the right conditions, my skin will heal. We're not taught that the same is true with our thoughts, with our emotions, with our inner experiences as well. The human body, like the skin, is just one of our organs. The brain is an organ, the heart is an organ, the liver is an organ. Our body is made up of organs. And all of these organs have the capacity to heal if the conditions are right. If given the correct conditions, every part of ourselves will naturally heal. It's getting to those conditions that is the hard part. And colonization has made it really difficult for us to figure out what those conditions are. So I'm differentiating here between practices that will help us heal. So how do we create the conditions in which our body, our emotions, our brain will be able to heal itself? How do we create those conditions? Versus what I'm calling coping or self-soothing practices, which are more along the lines of things that make us feel good. All right, so first, coping self-care practice. Treat yourself. So if you are a fan of Parks and Rec, you know this phrase. You know this is great. Like, I am not saying any of the coping or self-soothing practices are bad. Treating yourself is like, I'm all for that. Also, that is a coping method. That is not something that's going to help us heal. It is going to temporarily make us feel better, but not create a different condition so that healing can occur. With fun party time with friends, hanging out with friends just for fun. Again, great. Again, something we need, of course, something that can help us keep going when times are tough. If what we need is healing, it's not going to create that for us. And with exercise, letting off steam. Oftentimes in this society, we have overall in the society, we have a rather toxic perspective of what exercise is and what it should look like. So very often we are exercising for the purpose of changing the way our physical appearance looks in order to please other people, in order to attract a mate, in order to be more likable generally, in order to be viewed as or viewed in a particular way by society. When we are exercising for those types of purposes, the physical movement itself is healthy for us to a certain extent, and yet that's not healing. Any kind of substances, and you'll notice I have Netflix on there too. So again, I'm not saying like a Netflix binge is bad for you. A Netflix binge is not going to like suddenly land you in an addicted state. None of that. But if we turn to substances again and again and again as a coping mechanism, if my way of coping with my really stressful life is going home every evening and watching Netflix all night, again, I'm coping, but I'm not healing. I'm not moving out of where I am. So perhaps you're seeing some key themes here. Any sort of practice that is distracting to us, that is offering some sort of temporary distraction, like a vacation or a new car or a new romantic partner, that's a great distraction. Anything that is numbing, that's leading us into avoidance, keeping us away from whatever it is that's really going on with us in our minds and our brains and our bodies. Anything that is involving seeking something outside of us. For example, this image here, I do not know what I want, but I know I don't have it. Anything that is consumeristic or teaching us to seek for validation outside of ourselves, even if it's just needing like constant validation from other people, those things, again, aren't necessarily detrimental. They're not, however, going to provide a foundation for healing. On the other hand, practices that I would deem healing, authentic self-expression, art, writing, singing, journaling, sharing with others. Here's a lovely quote from Brene Brown. Authenticity is a practice. Here's another image I really like. Differences between fitting in and belonging. Authenticity is doing it for ourselves. Expression for ourselves. Another self-healing practice, learning about what it means to be human. Again, this comes back to that branch in the tree we looked at earlier. We're not taught this. And because we're not taught this, we don't know what we don't know. I'll talk a little bit about my journey in just a bit, but a huge part of it has been taking the initiative to educate myself in the way that I wish I'd been educated growing up. Teaching myself the things that I actually need to know about what it means to be a human, what it means to be in a physical body, that we're not taught in school yet. I think we'll get there. This is a lovely quote, or a meme thing, I guess you'd call it, from somebody that is pretty popular on Instagram, the holistic psychologist. I believe she also has a YouTube channel and probably a website. She's a psychologist who went through a lot of self-healing practices herself, and now that's what she talks about. So she says here, healing is a process of unlearning and relearning. It's returning to what you've always been underneath your social conditioning, underneath colonization. Pure consciousness. So consciousness meaning awareness, awake and aliveness, I would describe as consciousness. If you are curious, I would encourage you to explore that a bit. Boundary enforcement, huge self-healing practice. I included a little image up here again about why we people please, especially in the social work profession. I find this to be pretty common. A lot of us have grown up to be people pleasers for a lot of reasons, myself included. And then on the other hand, another image from the holistic psychologist, rethinking selfish, especially relevant for the holiday season. Self-care, setting boundaries is sometimes saying no to a family event, saying no to anything, to rest, canceling plans with a friend, focusing on your own happiness, changing your mind, doing what you want to do, prioritizing that above what other people tell us that we need to do. Here's another little checklist I thought was helpful. I won't read through this, but feel free to pause if you want to check it out. Learning what boundaries were and how to begin establishing them in my life with my relationships and with myself, hugely important for me. Mindful movement, another thing I have on this list. So this would be my counter to exercise. Like, of course, we are in a physical body. Of course, we need to move, to stretch, to get it, to just have some sort of movement incorporated into our experience. Of course, we need that. What I have found to be much more helpful than spending hours at the gym for myself is to learn about mindful movement instead. So I was raised, for example, with the expectation that like running or like really, really cardiovascular exercises were the best way to take care of yourself, the best way to care for your body and your mental health and all of that. I no longer believe that. And especially if you are someone who is interested in trauma healing, mindful movement can help. It is not just healthy for the body, but it also is physiologically regulating. And that's the thing that's missing from typical exercise, where we're just sort of like pushing and exerting ourselves. Mindful movement allows for us to slow down, to center our thoughts, to connect inward with our body, and physiologically regulate, aka get out of fight, flight, freeze. When we're having some sort of response, which oftentimes a lot of us are, if you've ever felt defensive, that is a fight, flight, freeze response. That's the fight part of that. If you feel defensive a lot, if you feel on edge a lot, if you have a mind that won't stop going, physiological regulation could be something that it is something that would be really helpful for you. And mindful movement is a great way to start with that. It helps calm us down, get us back in touch with ourselves. Conscious connection with nature is another thing that I want to add to this list. We're also not taught to view the earth this way, but much like I was giving the example earlier of my skin healing around this burn wound, the earth heals itself too. So the earth is a living being. The earth is alive, and the earth heals itself too, if the conditions are right. So when the conditions are not right, like of course we can damage aspects of the earth. And yet when we change that, when we create the conditions to allow for healing to happen, the earth will heal too. Ultimately, we all come from the earth. There is tons of science by now that shows that even per Western science, that there are healing benefits of nature. Fontenelle Forest in Omaha has gone a long way in trying to raise awareness about the healing benefits of nature in our own area here. So there are a lot of reasons why connecting, and I put consciously here, like intentional, not just I'm going to walk through the woods as fast as I can and like listen to really angry music. Like turn the music off, take your time, look at the trees, look at the flowers, like feel some sort of connection. That's the kind of exchange with nature that provides a healing avenue for us. So again, not that it's bad to just like, jam out to music while you're outside. I'm all for that as well. If your purpose is on healing, if your emphasis is on wanting to heal, I would just encourage you to do so a little bit more consciously. This is a fantastic book that, my gosh, I'm through just a few chapters at this point, but it really is deeply soul moving in terms of our connection to Mother Earth. And if this is something you're interested in, I would strongly recommend this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, written from an Indigenous perspective. So key themes of healing, really it comes down to a few pieces here. Expanding our internal awareness is huge, getting to know who we are on the inside rather than just trying to fit into what we're taught to be on the outside. Enhancing our mind-body connection, moving out of Cartesianism, which teaches us that our brain and our body are separate, and moving instead into realizing that they are the same, and developing heart coherence. So heart coherence is, if you Google it, you'll find there's actually like a heart math institute there that they, again, if you need science as proof for any of this, they can give you that science. Here's one image that can offer some science as to why heart coherence is important. But essentially what this means from a social work perspective, we get this. Essentially what this means is that my mind and my heart are aligned. The things that I feel are right in my body. When I have an experience and my body is like, oh yes, that was great, more of that, please. When I'm making decisions that are in line with both what my body, my heart wants and what my mind wants, I can get to a state of peace. I can get to a state of calm. I can get to a state of coherence. So as opposed to what this image shows is it throws off our heart rate when we're stuck in states that are sort of contrary to the healing practices that we're talking about now. So if I'm in a state of fear, if I'm anxious, if I'm worrying, if I just have my mental mind chattering all the time, and I was there for many years, trust me, I have been there too. What that means is our heart rate is irregular, it is escalated, it is amplified. This is why heart-related illnesses are astronomical in this country. I want to say that heart-related illnesses are the biggest cause of death in the United States. Cardiovascular related incidents. This is why, you guys, this is why, because we are not taught how to have heart coherence. We're not taught how to move through the world in a way that aligns with what our heart needs, to provide the conditions that our heart needs in order to function and heal and maintain itself. Self-healing practices can do that for us. All right, I want to end with this slide. I thought about my journey up to this point. It has been a journey. So I thought about my journey up to this point, and I wanted to share a few pieces that have really made a big difference for me. And this is building on what we've talked about already. So it's just sort of applying some personal examples. So developing mindfulness was hugely important for me. I was somebody who was really disconnected from my thoughts and emotions. When I first started learning about this stuff, I didn't know how to tell what was an emotion, what was a thought. I didn't know how to identify where things were happening in my body. I just was really stuck in the cognition part. I was really stuck in the mental capacities part. So for me, these practices were really important in developing my own ability to mindfully connect with myself, to find that physiological regulation. Yoga has been amazing. I've been doing it almost every day for 2 years now. At this point, I stick to 2 routines. I do sun salutations, and then I do the warrior sequence of poses. Pretty simple stuff. and has made a world of difference, not just in my mental health, but also in my physical health. I'm somebody who has struggled with chronic back pain since my bachelor's program, since my bachelor's degree, so over 10 years. Over 10 years ago, I'd been struggling with back pain until I started yoga. And I put BYO, be your own chiropractor here, because that's what's been true for me. Now when I do sun salutation, for example, like my back is just, you can just hear it popping. So it quite literally, what I know that I'm doing within my own body is realigning my spine. And I could go to a chiropractor and have somebody else do it for me, or I can do some yoga poses that help to adjust the parts that need to be adjusted based on the pain that I was having in my back. Lots of great information about the health benefits of yoga. Body scans and meditation have also been really important to me. So body scan is kind of like a type of meditation where you tune in to you can do a guided meditation, actually. So if you're curious, I would say like Google body scan, and you can find an option. And it's a guided meditation, so somebody will walk you through the process. They're usually like 20 to 40 minutes. The longer ones, like I know that's a time commitment, but it's worth it. It helps you learn how to identify different parts of your body, and it just walks you through starting at your tippy toes and all the way up to the top of your head, having you focus in on each part of your body and focus on relaxing it, focus on the sensations that you're experiencing. It's a way of reconnecting our brains with our bodies, because again, years and years of colonization have really landed us in a place where we're pretty detached. Social-emotional education was a huge part of my journey as well. That's how I know all this stuff that I'm telling you today, was through reading about neuroscience. I was tempted for a while to go on and try and get a PhD in neuroscience. Actually, I was like actively looking into programs. I was studying for the GRE. I don't think continuing in academia is meant to be a part of my future in that sort of way. But it is fascinating to know what is currently known about how human beings function. So The Body Keeps the Score is a book that I recommend to everyone. That's what got me interested in neuroscience. It's exactly what it sounds like. And there's a couple other images down here by Babette Rothschild, who's a social worker. So I wanted to include this as well. She has The Body Remembers as a series. So very similar things, essentially about how trauma is stored in the body. The stuff that happens to us in childhood doesn't just go away as we age, it stays within us. And knowing how that manifests is what can then help us heal from it. Learning about the chakra system too is what helps me figure out how to heal from some of those pieces as well. Chakra system is just basically the spaces in our body where we store different types of energy. Read more about it if you're curious. There's tons of info. Learning how to manage my energy, hugely important. Setting boundaries with myself and others. I sort of mentioned this earlier. I have a couple images here that really speak to my experience. Sometimes setting boundaries means disappointing other people. Sometimes it means being who we want to be instead of who other people want for us to be. So it's not always easy, and it's not always very pleasant, and yet it has been crucial for my experience, and I would imagine that's true for a lot of other people. So for me, that's really involved letting go of the stuff that's outside of my control, and focusing on the things that I can control. So setting boundaries with myself, for example, looks like being really intentional and conscious about the thoughts I'm having, the expectations I'm holding of myself, how I practice self-forgiveness. If I screw up or don't do a good job at something, what do I feel about that? What do I think about that? What am I willing to hold in my brain, basically? Like, what am I willing to hold in my brain? And part of this, I'm going to skip down, links into monitoring my information intake, because I don't want to hold a lot of that stuff in my brain, because when we hold stuff in our brain, we also hold it in our bodies, and the trauma affects us in one way or the other. So for me, I have basically been non-existent on social media for I was on Instagram for a little while, but I've just basically been AWOL from that for quite a while until I feel like I want to change that. TV and news as well. I get my news sporadically when I choose to. There's a fantastic NPR podcast called Up First. It's like a 10-minute morning podcast. I listen to that and get all the stuff that I need to know, and I don't read any articles about what's going on in the news unless I have a reason to. But those are just ways that I'm controlling what I can control, and I'm not getting sucked up into a lot of the fear-based messaging that's happening within the broader society. In terms of the more alternative things on this list, crystals, salt baths, oils, etc. This is just an image. Crystals have really been monumental for me. I have like our whole house is decorated with crystals. I brought a few to show you. Here's amethyst. This is a clear quartz crystal. What's amazing about these things is like, this is from the earth. This is from the ground. Nobody, I mean, people polished it, yes, not this side though. People polished it, yes, but like nobody created this. Earth created this. So you can go on and read a lot about different stones. They have different kinds of associations. Like, for example, here's one image breaking down different stones by the different chakras we have. So there's a lot of information you can find about how crystals work. Again, they're all associated with like different types of energy. So one thing that and I'm actually wearing one right now. So I even have a necklace where I can I put a little crystal inside of it. I don't know if you can see this, I guess, but the crystal comes out of the pouch and then I can change it if I want. So it just comes out like that. I'm not going to take it out though. and so I can wear a crystal with me too. It's just a way of tuning into the type of energy that I want to be experiencing. So the one I have right now is lapis lazuli. It's a good one for public speaking. So it's a good one to wear for my voice, for my throat chakra. So sometimes I'll wear those when I'm teaching, for example. A mind-boggling piece of information about this that you should know. This is a quote from Nikola Tesla. If you're not familiar with Nikola Tesla, I would encourage you to look into that. He was one of the inventors of energy, and had he had his plan, we would have energy free outside of capitalism without being charged for it monetarily. He had a system in mind of how to manufacture free energy. And he has this quote here about crystals, and this is confirmed in other things too. There's research articles that I found that talk about how crystals breathe. So, I mean, obviously it's different than how we breathe, but if we think about it, like, we don't see trees breathe, but we know that they are somehow. The same is true with crystals. Like, I might think that this is just like a piece of glass, basically, but it's not. It's from the earth, and therefore it is alive, just in a different way. It's alive like a tree is alive, even slower than that. So a lot of people have connections with crystals for that reason. Yeah, salt baths, essential oils, great stuff as well. With the salt bath, literally, I would just add like Epsom salt and some essential oils, like a few drops of essential oils, and I take those still all the time as a way of sort of like cleansing and maintaining my energy. Water and salt have been shown to be really healing and detoxifying, and it's also just another way to have some built-in relaxation time. So yes, lots of different ways, and there's so many things other than this too. This is what I've done that's worked for me, but there's so many other ways of managing and monitoring your energy as well. Decolonizing my worldview. So maybe you can understand why this is, since we started out on a slide like the one that we did. So for this, I pulled out a few pieces, but I know that I'm forgetting things here. This has been a several year journey for me of learning about these things. So the ones that came to mind, an Indigenous people's history for sure. Like, that's a really accessible way to learn about colonization in the United States. This Decolonize to Survive initiative is something that's coming out of Australia. Australia has had a lot of experiences with colonization as well, and still lots of bad things happening in Australia, and lots of people speaking up against it too. So learning what are other countries who also have experienced and are experiencing colonization, learning about what have they done, how are they coping, has been helpful for me. Looking into all kinds of stuff. So this is an image of the Hopi Declaration of Peace. The Hopi people in the United States are the longest standing indigenous tribe. I actually spent some time on the Hopi reservation this summer on my first solo trip anywhere really. And yeah, they're known for that. So they're known for being the longest standing indigenous population who was able to maintain their culture a bit stronger than some other indigenous populations have been able to do so. So there's a lot of information about Hopi people. You have to be kind of careful if you research it, just because a lot of it is sort of appropriative-y, a lot of white people writing about Hopi populations, but there's also good stuff too. Just again, like that exposure, that learning, that being able to view society from a different perspective, hugely important. So the same in terms of like learning about ancient religions, for example, learning about the differences, but I think more importantly, some of the similarities between major religions, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, both which span out of India, and Christianity, for example, if you want to. I just pulled that image off randomly. I honestly ignore what's in that image. This is just an example. I don't know where it's from, and I don't know whether it's good information or not. However, I do know there's lots of overlap between ancient religions in terms of spiritual beliefs. And for me, that's been really empowering to learn about. I think it's called The Pyramid Codes. It's a show on Netflix. And there's other sources of information you can read as well. But reading more about ancient Egypt has been really helpful. And specifically sort of reframing my understanding of how advanced they were. So for example, the pyramid codes and this image here talks about the pyramids were not like tombs like we're commonly taught to believe. Instead, they were actually power centers. So if we remember again, like Nikola Tesla had invented a free way, a way to get free access to energy, to electricity, for example, to all of us here in the United States. And yet, unfortunately, his idea was stolen and it was capitalized upon. However, in ancient Egypt, the pyramids did similar things for Egyptians. So there are cultures who have adapted to and developed very sustainable ways of living that we're not taught about, that I wasn't taught about at least. And so taking the initiative to learn about them, it's just really helpful. Looking into just some like underlying practices too. There's different sounds that are associated with the different sounds that Earth makes that can be very healing for us. Charles Eisenstein is somebody that I wanted to mention. He has a website, a whole bunch of videos, a whole bunch of books that are actually free in PDF form online. One of the things he talks about is shifting into a gift economy, shifting out of capitalism, or even like not going into socialism, not going into communism, not moving into any other economic system, instead evolving into a gift economy. So this book is his writings about that. Astrology for me has been something that's just been very interesting to learn about as well. It has helped me understand myself in ways that I never did before. This is a picture of a natal chart. This is my natal chart, actually. And oftentimes when we hear people talk about astrology, it is like the most superficial, westernized version where we know our sun sign and then that's who we are. We're just our sun sign and that's it. That's not how it works. It is quite a bit more complex than that. What I love about astrology is that it can point to key lessons, key patterns that are likely to come up in this lifetime. It can point to like ideal destinations, or I would call them like soul pullings, like the stuff that we feel drawn towards. Our natal chart can speak to that. So it provides a lot of complex, layered information into who we are as a person, and perhaps more importantly, how do we fit into this world. So astrology, not everybody's bag, but for me has been really amazing to learn about in that sort of a context as well. And especially in astrology, if you have questions or want to chat, let me know. There's also organizations like WOOF. So WOOF it stands for, it's an acronym, Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. And there's United States locations that you can go and participate in this process with. And it's also an international program. So to me, this is an ongoing current process that can be used to help people decolonize their worldviews. If I'm able to go and live in somebody else's self-sustainable community or work on somebody else's self-sustainable farm for a month, 2 months, 3 months, that's going to change my experience. It's going to change what I view as possible for myself. It's one way that we can sort of expand out of the narrow, socially constructed version of reality we've been stuck into. So yeah, lots of learning, but I'm somebody who loves to learn. Maybe you could guess. Final top 5 self-care essential, embracing authenticity. This one is not easy, and yet it is critically important. So this is a quote that really inspired me when I was first setting out on a self-authenticity journey. If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. This is how I felt for quite a while in my life. And finally, I just had to make some other decisions. So cut my hair off, shave the side of my head. If you knew Amy like 4 or 5 years ago, you know that my appearance has changed drastically. The way that I dress has changed. I no longer wear makeup. I got a very visible tattoo on my arm, which you've probably seen in videos. So I made some external choices to indicate like, hey, I'm stepping into who I am now. I'm not going to be who I was before. It was a way of sort of like taking power back over who I wanted to be rather than who other people were perceiving me as. Life choices, similar thing there in terms of really just prioritizing who I was as opposed to what other people wanted for me. Similar to boundaries here. A few other things I wanted to throw up. All quotes so the Maston Kipp person and Chandel Stewart person, I don't know either of those. I'm totally just like borrowing their quote because I thought it was a good quote. Audre Lorde, fantastic. Look her up. She's got lots of great stuff. Rumi is like an ancient, I guess I would call him like a philosopher type person, spiritual guru type person. He would be good to look into as well. But I don't know Maston Kipp or Chandel Stewart. But I do like what they had to say here, at least. So the answers you seek are within you. Don't let the loud voice of fear drown out your wise and powerful self. Chandel says there's a place within you that contains all the answers you seek, but when you are disconnected from or unaware of this place within yourself, you may often feel lost and out of place. Again, that was me for a lot of years too. Remember, the entrance to the sanctuary is inside of you. All of this to say that really one of the most important things for me has been learning how to get out of the pattern, learning how to get out of the impulse, the urge, the desire to find the answers outside of myself. And sometimes that included like directly asking other people, like, what should I do here? What's the right decision to make? How do I know? Is this person a good person? Whatever. No longer do I seek that kind of information externally from myself. I seek the answer inward. So when I have to make a decision, when I have to choose a different path to take in life, I tune inwards, and that is how I make my decision. And this has been incredibly empowering, and it has also stopped a lot of the previous pattern in which I would follow what other people suggested that I do. And of course it wouldn't work out. And then I was left kind of dealing with the aftermath and picking up the pieces of that. So it was kind of a lesson learned the hard way for me of why I shouldn't be listening to other people more than I listen to myself. And yet it has taught me some really valuable lessons about how to get really calm and clear. And the benefit of all this meditation stuff is that that's exactly what it helps us do. It helps us clear out the chatter, clear out all the stuff we're socialized to think about, all the stuff that's been programmed into our minds, and to get really calm and centered and make decisions from that like heart coherence sort of place. I would say that's similar to like when our chakras are aligned, we're in a place of being able to tap into inner wisdom that we don't have access to when we're stuck up in our brains all the time. Okay, that is my top 5. I also included, I'm not going to read these for you, but I also included a few other images from the holistic psychologist. She just makes these awesome, I think you call these memes, right? These are memes. She makes these awesome memes, and her Instagram is just covered with them. Here's a few that I really like that have been meaningful for me, very much along the same lines of what we've been talking about. Pause if you want to check it out. And I wanted to share this. This is just a helpful resource to hang on to if and when you get into that sort of place where you feel like you are on the cusp of giving up. Know that all of us have been there. Know that all of us have felt similarly. Of course, not exactly like you feel, because we're all individual, unique human beings, and yet we all experience human emotion in the same way because we're all human. And that's really what connects us. And those are the reasons why social constructs of race and gender and all that stuff is just less meaningful, because what really matters for humans is what's going on the inside. So know if you are feeling any kind of way, you are not alone. Other people have been there too. There's information out there that can help you if you know how to find it. And more importantly, there's so much that you can do. There's so much more that you can do to help yourself than what we're actually taught. Okay, so that is all I have today. I hope that has been interesting, and I again encourage you, like, reach out with questions, comments. I love that. All this stuff is my favorite stuff to talk about, so I will gladly go on or just kind of share information or resources or whatever. So have a great rest of your day, everybody, and take care.